Hi everyone, I'm Kyle Bechet, and this is the AAF Exchange, a podcast from the American Action Forum, where experts provide clear, data-driven insights into today's economic and domestic policy issues. Welcome, and thank you for tuning in. On this episode of the AAF Exchange, the debt limit vote, the return of the Green New Deal, and the latest read on the economy. Joining us to discuss all of this are AAF's President, Douglas Holtz-Eakin, and later on, Director of Fiscal Policy, Gordon Gray. Doug, thank you for joining us.
My pleasure.
How have things been?
Things are good.
Yeah.
NFL draft tonight. Big night.
NFL draft tonight. Yeah, we're looking forward to it. I think the Patriots have an early half of the selection. May trade up, might trade back. Who knows what Belichick's going to do?
Yeah. Well, and as usual, I'm enraged.
Yeah.
Because I have to listen to you talk about the Patriots. But let's move on.
Speaking of enraged, tell us what's on your mind.
Look, it's a very, very rich field. Let's just pull the revival of the FSOC out of this choice. The FSOC was created by the Dodd-Frank Act. It's an entity in search of a mission. There is no way to measure systemic risk, and it's supposed to control it. So it's going to fail no matter what it does. So it went out and it basically designated a bunch of insurance companies as systemically important. The courts decided they had no clue what they were up to. The designations, process-wise, were a mess. Substantively, there was no reason to do it other than the fact they were big. And the FSOC went away, basically, for years. But they just passed new rules at the FSOC that said, hey, we don't have to have a reason to designate someone as systemically important. We can just skip the benefit cost tests, say, we don't like you, you're big, we're gonna regulate you. And this is a terrible development. There's no discipline now in the process. And, when we looked at this, a long time ago, it was probably 5 years ago now, it was going to be very costly to consumers to put people like BlackRock and other asset managers under the FSOC regime because they have to hold more capital, they can't invest as nimbly, and you get lower retirement returns. So this just makes me crazy. This is literally regulation for the sake of regulation without thinking about the American people. And it's the worst use of it.
Yeah, is this more part of their whole anti-big
This is the
agenda?
This is the influence of Elizabeth Warren on the Biden administration. She has populated the agencies with her kind of financial regulators, and they are ultimately a real threat to the basic average consumer.
Interesting. All right, well, with that being said, let's jump to the economic news as we have started doing these days, as it's the hot topic around town. This morning, we got the Q1 GDP numbers. They came in
1.1.
1.1. What's your read on the report?
So it's a deceptively low top line. It was driven down by an over 2 percentage points subtraction out of inventories, fairly transitory. Inside, everyone keeps doing this sort of death watch on the American consumer. That's not going to be the issue. Mm-hmm. Consumer spending was fine. The issue is going to be business spending, and it was essentially flat. We continue to have negative investment in equipment. Non-residential structures are back, but they're not a big component, so they're growing rapidly, but they're not a lot of it. And then intellectual property products, software, basically, is driving the business spending. But overall, the business sector looks flat. If it moves from flat to going south, that's the sign that we're really having a problem. But that's not in this report. The other thing we learned is that core PCE, personal consumption expenditure inflation, using the market-based version, looks a lot like it did 2 quarters ago when it was 5%. It came in at 4.9. Again, we keep having this conversation. Yes, inflation is coming down, but very slowly. And, the Fed's leaned really hard and made modest progress on the inflation problem. So more to come.
Yeah, so as you just brought up inflation, since last we talked, we had the CPI numbers. Tomorrow, Friday, we'll get the PCE index, which is the Fed's preferred method of tracking inflation. What progress are we making? Is it just slow progress? Is there an end in sight? What's going on here?
If you want to see progress, look at goods price inflation. There's been tremendous progress there, and part of the reason is that the housing sector is literally dead in the water. We got more data out of home sales and things like that this week, and everything's down 20% year over year. So If you really kill the housing sector, you kill a lot of the goods demand, and that problem's by and large solved. The problem remains is services, and the poster child is shelter services. And in both the CPI and in the PC, when it comes out tomorrow, we're going to find that services inflation remains somewhere in the vicinity of 4.5, depending on which measure you pick. And that's not moving down very fast. So, when the Fed started its tightening regime, the sort of core PCE inflation rate measured in market prices was 4.9% year over year. It's going to be down to about 4.5% year over year, and we've been at this for a year and raised rates 5 percentage points. So that's not a lot of progress.
Yeah. Well, it'll be interesting to see what the PC index is tomorrow, and people will have to tune into your video just to that we will record at 8:30 to figure out what the actual read is on that. On a related note to all this, with the economy, every week it seems like we're getting new layoffs, new headlines about layoffs in the economic sector, from the tech sector to Disney. I think was the most recent one. Is this becoming a trend? If so, do you foresee these layoffs increasing for the remainder of the year? I know on top of all this, we had the unemployment claims this morning, which came in lower than I think anticipated.
Expected, yeah. So we get the high-profile layoffs. First, it was the tech sector, and now we're seeing some in retail and other places. But they're not big enough to move the aggregate unemployment rate a bit. We haven't seen the kind of sharp spike in new claims for unemployment insurance that are characteristic of an economy entering a downturn. And so the economy is slowing. There's no question about it. And some sectors are in genuine recession. Tech, housing, those are the two most prominent. But they're the exceptions. They're not the rule, and those high-profile layoffs don't translate into large-scale job loss. Most of those people are finding other jobs.
Yeah, it seems like it really is just the layoffs portion of the economy right now is just the sector-by-sector stuff, and that you read that the tech sector is laying off people, but the service industry is picking up people.
I mean, I think most people, including those in the tech sector, would argue they overplayed their hand in the pandemic. They thought they had a permanent increase in the use of streaming services and the content that was going into that. And it turned out that with the resumption of more normal economic activity, they had overhired and overbuilt, and they're just correcting that right now.
Right. All right, let's turn to Congress. It's back. Last week, the Green New Deal reared its enormous head once again. The bill was reintroduced. Not really a surprise there, but what may still catch people by surprise, is what's actually in this thing and how much it would cost. Could you walk us through all this?
So the Green New Deal, when it was originally introduced as a House and Senate resolution, you had to decide whether it was the part you cared about was the green, which is ostensibly climate, or the New Deal, which was guaranteed jobs, guaranteed wages, free college, just a list of social programs that was enormously long and super expensive. I mean, there's no question about it. We were in the 90s of trillions of dollars, and we left out free college education. We missed it. So it's never been a realistic proposal. It will not be a realistic proposal again. Among progressives, New Deal always sounds good. Green sounds good. So the advertising is what it is. They've marketed it well. But it's really just a statement that says we don't like anything about what's going on. We want the government to have an enormous role in the economy. We want to just overnight snap our fingers and get rid of all fossil fuels and have this clean energy portfolio. And we want everything to be equitable and fair. That's all great, but it's not legislating and it's not realistic. And so there'll be a little fanfare and it will go away.
Yeah, I mean, we do have that great piece at AAF about the Green New Deal that basically walked through, the costs of part of these programs if you actually made them not resolution.
Yes, and made them law.
Made them law.
And the whole point of doing that is not to say we got the number right. It's to just illustrate the scale of the proposals. It's a wholesale overthrow of the U.S. economy and the U.S. system of governance. That's all it is. And so if you put the price tag on it, you realize that.
Yeah, but at the same time, it is important to talk about these messaging bills because, as we know, messaging bills slowly become law, and it takes a long time for these things to become
and that's
law.
all they're going to do for a couple of years.
Yeah,
right? There's
it's
not
just
gonna be a
message
lot
on
of,
this, and then try and get something over the finish line at some point.
Right.
Well, anyways, Doug, thanks for joining us.
My pleasure.
We will move on to our debt conversation with Gordon Gray, but as always, thanks for joining us to talk about Congress and the economy.
It's nice to be the uplifting part of the conversation. Enjoy.
Thank you. We're now going to bring in AAF's Director of Fiscal Policy, Gordon Gray. Gordon, thank you for joining us.
How are you doing, Kyle?
It's been a while since I had you on the podcast, but it's great to have you back on. How have you been?
Just peachy.
Yeah.
Still there across the hallway from you. So
yeah, we still, we have our conversation about food and all that fun stuff, but and now golf. Hopefully we get our golf outing in soon. But some stuff's been happening in Congress recently, so figured we'd have you on to talk about that.
For sure.
Let's jump right into it. The debt ceiling. After weeks of back and forth, I think we've been talking about this since January at this point. House Republicans put together their plan to raise the debt limit, and last night actually voted on and passed it through the House. Start by walking us through what is going on with all this.
Sure.
Get us up to date.
So this is a process that we engage in from time to time, periodically, and which is to say, raising the federal debt limit, the authority that the federal government, the Treasury Department, has to borrow, raise cash, and pay our bills. We're running deficits, which means that incoming tax revenue is not insufficient to cover how much money we're spending, and so we have to borrow the difference. And there is a law that limits the ability of Treasury to borrow. It's essentially an allowance. And given the extraordinary expenditures during the pandemic, inflation, and just the basic structure of U.S. public finance, from time to time, we have to raise it. And we do have to raise it were the Treasury Department be unable to borrow. It would be catastrophic for the U.S. and global economy. However, U.S. public finance is unsustainable, and we rarely grapple with that fact. It is a bipartisan tradition to kick this can down the road, and periodically, the debt limit serves as an opportunity to have that conversation. And we are having that conversation right now.
Yeah, it seems like on the spending side of this, they've kicked the can down the wrong road for so long that now you're coming into it. You're coming up against the wall here. Social Security and Medicare are going to become problems and unsustainable at some point. What are the highlights of this Republican plan to raise the debt limit, but also rein in spending?
So the House Republican bill has several major components. The most conspicuous, the one that does by far the most of the work in this bill, is essentially capping discretionary spending. So this is the roughly 1/3 of the federal budget, even slightly less than that Congress actually has to deal with every year. And so this includes the Department of Defense and then basically the operating budgets for all other federal agencies. And essentially what House Republicans have proposed is we will cap that, the growth of spending in this slice of the budget to 1% over the next decade. And the effect of that is, compared to the rate at which it would otherwise be growing, this is a cut relative to that trajectory. And the difference is over $3.5 trillion in spending cuts over the next decade. And that's a lot of money. That's, trillions is the new billions, but, 3.5 of them, that adds up. However, over the next decade, we're going to spend $80 billion. Our deficit is going to be over $20 trillion. So the numbers have just gotten huge. And so to the extent that we're going to have a discussion about fiscal policy, I give credit to House Republicans for taking this on. I have at least going through and assembling a bill that can pass the House of Representatives and say, here's where we are. it's time for the next step.
Yeah.
So I think the developments from last night and the passage of this bill is a meaningful step towards a resolution to this problem.
Yeah, so speaking of next steps, I mean, you have the Republicans have passed their plan. The White House still saying, oh, we want a clean debt limit or raise the debt limit. But the date is coming up here. It's some say May, some say June, some say later on this summer. It all depends on those extraordinary measures that are happening, and of course how much money the Treasury takes in. With I think we already had tax day, but there's the business day coming up in June or something like that. So what happens next? How does this get resolved?
So. A couple things, and I'll speak to the so-called X Day first, because that's it's a moving target because the X Day, for the listeners, is the moment at which the Treasury really runs out of room. They have exhausted their toolbox of accounting tricks that they've been using to continue to borrow, to continue to pay bills. While Congress is negotiating, or not negotiating, if you listen to the White House, eventually that toolbox runs out. And this has been a feature of debt limit debates since the 90s, where we hit the number at which Congress said was the debt limit, but Treasury's like, well, okay, that gives us, we are now in a position where we have to utilize these tools to keep borrowing, but everybody knows they have these tools, so the real debt limit isn't when they hit the number that they enact, but when Treasury runs out of its authorities. The problem is no one's really sure when that happens, because it's also a function of how much cash the Treasury brings in over that period of time, and those cash flows are volatile. Just like Doug was talking about business activity, well, tax revenue is a function of business activity, and we can't completely accurately predict the future, and we certainly can't completely accurately predict the future about tax receipts for the same reason. So the X date is moving around as we get closer. This data becomes less of a theoretical exercise than an actual one.
Right. So the White House and the House and Speaker McCarthy have to get together at this point and figure out, is there any amount of spending cuts that you think will get through? I mean, is this setting up for is this just going to set up a budget conversation? What happens over the next couple of months?
So the most important thing, the most important development in this debate, since basically people started yapping about it several months ago, happened last night. Yeah. Which was, it had been Democrats' view, their bet was that House Republicans would be dysfunctional, wouldn't get on the same page, and produce a piece of legislation passed by one of the two houses in Congress, and send it to the Senate. The bet was House Republicans would squabble and ultimately implode under the weight of the task. They didn't. It was close. Yeah. But there is now one bill in Congress to raise the debt limit. Yeah. And it's now the Senate's problem. And here's what I do know is that the Senate doesn't have the votes to pass a clean debt limit. The preferred outcome from the White House doesn't have the votes in Congress. And they need to wake up to that fact. They have been intransigent on this. They have said, we are not negotiating. It's like, well, Congress,
political reality,
you need the votes to pass a law. Yeah. It's inconvenient for you. It makes being president less fun. Sorry.
But that's the way it is.
Yeah.
Well, anyway, I guess we'll have to wait and see on a lot of this. I mean, it's going to continue to play out over the next couple of weeks. I'm sure we'll have you back on the podcast a bunch to give us regular updates on this. But thank you for joining us and getting us up to speed on this.
Always a pleasure.
I hope you enjoyed this conversation. Tune back in for our next episode, where our experts will provide clear, data-driven insights into today's economic and domestic issues. I'd also encourage you to check out any of the links in our show notes, and also follow us on social media to learn more about AAF. Don't forget to subscribe on iTunes, Spotify, or Google Play.